So I'm going to speak about uncertainty and some of the interface between food production, a little bit about urban design and natural capital, largely in the context of the province of Alberta. So with relatively few exceptions, most Western economies are driven by pistons involving the extraction, processing, translocation of commodities such as crops and wood fiber, hydrocarbons, and mineral. And certainly Alberta is no exception to that. But now we stand at a time where commodity prices have suffered a bit, and people are wondering whether the current policies that drive Alberta will generate appropriate economic prosperity, and how does agriculture fit into that milieu? Maybe now is an appropriate time to re-examine some of those policies. We're reminded that, if we look back through time, Alberta's seen a trajectory, a time series of land uses that have defined it. First Nations being the dominant land use for many thousands of years, trapping, bison hunting, the arrival of forestry and mining, the very importance of agriculture, and more recently, the energy sector. So the point here is that land uses can come and they can go, and their relative contributions can change, which reminds us that we should be thinking about what policies are going to shape the future of Alberta and what role will agriculture play. So if we look into the future, and I won't go through these, but you can look at them, what will the dominant elements of the province of Alberta be that define our economy? And what role will agriculture play in that? Because I think people are rethinking that as they better understand some of the challenges of having excessive dependency on certain land uses. Now, clearly, as we produce food, and we've heard it referred to earlier today by several of the speakers, there's increasing recognition that we need to be representing triple bottom line. So we fragment what's a system into it's got to be, it's got to have economic indicators and social and environment. But when you actually dig down into them in many ways, it's just it's a continuum, and they overlap significantly. I guess the line that we might describe is that the marketplace is asking us to do a better job of all three elements. And I think Anne talked about public license to operate. So increasing challenges in terms of how we produce our food. Now, the challenges that confront Alberta, I think we could use almost any geography to look at, but given that we're all here in Alberta, it's a good place to maybe focus in on some of the data and to see what kind of patterns are unfolding and what it has to say specifically about agriculture, but more in the context of all the suites of overlapping land use practices that are shaping the province. And what we see is that there are key challenges. So I'll kind of get to the end and then give you some of the concluding comments and then try and support them. But there are very compelling challenges to the agri-food sector in the province of Alberta. First of all, there is only one landscape. It's not even changing by a square centimeter in size, but it's changing fast and radically in composition. And whether it be forestry, energy, agriculture, transportation, or residential, it's continuing to compete for the finite land base. So agriculture is in a competition with others for land base, whether it be residential or industrial. There's an increasing demand, again, for triple bottom line, whether we're looking at it as carbon. We had a great talk by Robin Leach earlier. Water, both quality and quantity, biodiversity. All of those issues are at play, and somehow we need to conduct our land uses, generate the commodities that society wants, but do it in a way that meets market demands for these other broader performance indicators. Now, at the source of it all is the human population. And if we look at Alberta and we grow it through time, you can see here, and maybe you can see the decades at the bottom. Back in the 1930s, again, we were 80% rural and 20% urban. And now here we're just getting to 2010. You can see the Edmonton-Calgary corridor quite nicely. And if we take a middle-of-the-road trajectory and grow it into the future, we see that population grow. And of course, it needs food. And I think, as was mentioned earlier, most of that growth in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor is occurring in overlap with our best black loams. So people need to eat. So if we grow the people and we understand where they're falling asleep at night, and we know how much they need to eat based on body mass, whether it be on the crop side or the livestock side, we can compute, as we're going to show in this time series, how much food, how much land would be required to feed people. And what this map is showing is not where the food is being produced, but where it's being consumed. And of course, we've got some people living in acreages and rural residential, but majority of the people are living in the city. Now, back in this decade, we would have needed about 8 to 9 million hectares of cropland to meet our own domestic needs. But if this population continues to grow at the rate it is, we're closer to 13 to 14 million hectares of land and crop required to feed Albertans. Now, I think everyone knows here that our province, and we're very proud of it, has a history of exporting food. So it's worth asking the question of how long that pattern will continue on a net basis. We'll always export food, but we may fairly quickly be in a stage where we're a net importer. Now, if we're eating food, maybe some of it's coming from Alberta, of course it is. So let's take a look at actually how, through time, decade by decade, and it's kind of hard to see the decades in the bottom, but 1940s and 50s, as we've seen how we develop the croplands we do, taking us to, and depending if you put improved pasture on here, kind of 10 or 11 million hectares. And I think there was a reference earlier today that that continues to grow, and it is. Croplands are expanding into pasture lands, and the key reason for it is croplands are being displaced by rural residential and urban expansion, sprawl, and what we're seeing is a net loss of croplands on our good soils being displaced geographically onto poor soils, which often historically have been in pasture. So there's a really interesting dynamic there. Now, on the flip side of agriculture from crops, of course, is livestock, and we've got a livestock population, and here we're getting to see how it's grown through time, decade by decade, with interdecadal variation depending on commodity prices and world events. And so it's significant, and there we get to see its distribution. But if you're going to have crops, you have to allow them to eat food, and here we're seeing the changes as that livestock population increased in terms of how much food, basically about 25 million metric ton of forage required to keep cattle today, and if that population were to continue to grow, so would that forage demand. Now, one of the key things that we've seen out of this is a radical change from an extensive livestock production system to an intensive one. So the pink line is looking at the total population in terms of population days. If you could count every cow every day and say, are you out on pasture or improved forage, or are you in a feedlot? And you can see that basically in the 50s and 60s, we made that really noticeable shift so that the vast majority of our cattle in terms of person days or cattle days are in the intensive end of the spectrum. For those of you that don't have a lot of familiarity with feedlots, we're growing them here, and you should start to see their presence as it lights up with the heat map in the Edmonton-Calgary corridor, but specifically around Lethbridge. And so we have a significant amount of area dedicated to feedlots, which is so important to us in terms of the economy of scale and intensity for growing cattle. But there's also some very real consequences of that we need to think about. In some of the talks I've given recently, people go, what's a feedlot? So I'm just asking ALCES here to go and find a bunch, and you know, they vary from big to small, and you know, a big one in Alberta would be what, 15,000 head or something like that. So these have become the defining feature required to allow us to produce cattle at the scale and magnitude, and of course it's fully integrated with how we grow our forage crops, which are the field stock for that. This graph, the upper one, reminds us of basically 110 years ago how we were killing cattle, and we were killing them at about 48 months. And they were raised primarily on grass. Today, that's different statistically, and depending on your husbandry system, it could be a little longer or shorter, but on average, the animals that we kill in the province of Alberta today are killed at 18 months, and very little of their time statistically would be grass-fed, and primarily grass-finished, of course. So we've changed the system radically. It's allowed us to significantly increase the amount of livestock we hold and produce and harvest, but it's certainly become a lot more intensive. Now, related to this is, if this is such an important feature, we're increasingly finding themselves living close to intensive livestock operations or feedlots or whatever we wish to call them. And as we have the bow wave of rural residential moving through Alberta, that probability will increase even more so. So in many cases, the feedlots predate rural residential expansion, but the conflicts can be there, so that can be an important issue. Secondly, we're also concentrating, of course, our cattle in very small areas and producing a lot of manure, which is being applied to agricultural fields, and often with tremendous challenges in balancing nitrogen and phosphorus, particularly phosphorus. So I think we talked earlier about the paramount importance of our soils and some of the degradation that's going on because of the significant scale of which we're producing livestock manure, which will increase. So one question I think deserves attention from an agriculture perspective is to wonder what the marketplace is going to want in 5, 10, 20 years. And yes, we've seen intensification, and these would just be examples, say from my grandparents' farm to how livestock are produced today, or the monocultures of the scale, or even how we manage fence lines. And so we have made wonderful progress in terms of efficiencies that have converted energy into crop biomass and livestock biomass, but we've also changed the nature, the scale, the complexion of much of Alberta, and in so doing have changed the quality of a broad range of natural capital from air, land, and water. Is it an appropriate trade-off? Is it the trade-off our consumer markets want? Will they provide signals to us that say that we need to find a different balance? So here I'm just showing land use by land use, the footprint, to remind us that the agricultural sector does not exist in a vacuum. Alberta is being shaped by livestock and crops, by the forest sector, the energy sector, the transportation network, and where we fall asleep, the residential network. It's a busy landscape. And so as all of those other land uses grow and become more intensive, agriculture is often the derivative. Here I'm just zooming in a little bit west of Edmonton, kind of a place that I grew up on a farm near Stony Plain, and just remind ourselves of how complex the landscape is. All of these land uses, without exception, would all prefer to be on growth mandates. They're all unacceptably small relative to where they want to be. So, busy landscape, we're trying to produce food, whether it be crop or livestock. They all require inputs, and they're having effects on natural capital in the marketplaces, saying you've got to compete not only at a provincial scale, but it's a global marketplace today, and not everyone is playing by the same rules. So we can accept that all of these land uses are at play. They're all dynamic, they're all growing, and agriculture is trying to find its way in the midst of this milieu. Just to help people understand the scale at which things are happening, so if you can imagine that you'd be in this workshop or this conference for 8 hours today, during those 8 hours on average, residential footprint will expand by 10 hectares. We'll drill 14 new wells. We'll drive 40 million kilometers. We'll produce 4,000 metric ton of dry waste. There'll be about 90 new people in this province. And we'll log about 72 hectares. And that'll happen every 8 hours throughout the day, every day of the year. So, yes, our economy may not be what it was 2 years ago, but it's still a very vibrant economy, and it's producing lots of commodities. And if you start adding up, what do we produce? And these are just annual productions. You know, the top ones are all talking about animals, and chickens are in kilograms, and crops are in ton, and wood fiber in cubic meters. But the point is, even though our economy has dropped down a little bit, you would still be very hard placed to find any other geography in North America that's producing commodities at this pace and tempo. So, busy. And you can't do that without changing your landscape. So these are the conversions that have happened in the last 120 years in the province of Alberta. We have found a way to change native grassland into cultivated crop at 11 million hectares. Another 14 million hectares is being grazed. We've got 250,000 hectares in cities. We've got even more than that in rural residential. We've got 24 million hectares in timber production. Footprint of the transportation sector is almost 500,000 hectares, and the energy sector is over 1 million. All of these are influencing water and carbon and air. They're all competing for inputs. They all have supply chains that interact. And we continue to talk about agriculture often as a silo, and then talk about forestry and talk about energy. Andrew's talk earlier about carbon, I think, helps us remind ourselves that all of these land uses are all about shifting carbon, whether it be biotic or whether it be stuff that died a long time ago and we're digging out of the ground as bitumen today. So the carbon story reminds ourselves that we, in fact, are dealing with a system. To kind of bring this home, if you look at these graphs, left is on crop, right is on basically the land producing meat. What the model is doing is tracking the total amount of demand in the province of Alberta and the total amount of supply. And as you can see, there was a time we didn't produce crops in Alberta and we didn't have livestock, so it was in balance. And then we produced more crop, and more livestock, and we had an access to our own provincial needs. So we were basically provisioning other geographies, right? We're exporting, net exporters. In fact, all of us know that's our history, that's our pride in terms of agriculture, is that we've fed much of the world. Well, when you take our human population and let it grow, the demand for crops and livestock is going up. But the amount of land that we can build this stuff on is going down. And so what the model shows quite nicely is in both cases, if these current trajectories increase, and I'm going to lay out right now, I'm making production rates constant today. So I'm basically taking 2015 production rates and pushing them into the future. In fact, our production rates on a per hectare basis could and probably will go up. But if they don't, quite quickly we're going to find ourselves in a situation where the demand for these commodities actually exceed the ability of this province to supply them. And that'll be an interesting stage in our future. Kind of dig into this in a little bit more detail as to why some of this is going. Let's look at black loams, and I think Ann and Vic were discussing it earlier, in the context of where we grow. So here's our black loams in the province of Alberta decade by decade, and we're looking at all footprints that aren't agricultural here. And we're seeing how quickly these soils are being lost through roads, acreages, towns. Get 10 minutes left? Thanks. And it's going to continue. So those people that were producing some of our best crops proximal cities are taking their money and they're being displaced to soils that are not as good, often as was referred to earlier, to pasture lands. And so we can actually zoom in here and maybe just have you look at it a little more closely. You can almost see Banff there, and what we're looking at is the expansion decade of the non-agricultural footprint in around Calgary, taking us to today and into the future. So this dynamic continues to unfold. Water, critically important. All these land uses require it. All of it influences both quantity and quality. And so if we actually simulate nitrogen, phosphorus runoff for every land use, adjusting for slope and aspect and elevation, we get to see that a lot of the changes in water quality actually occur in the white area associated with agriculture. So agriculture is a very important interface with water, and the adoption of best management practices is a very key determinant of how well this water will perform in the future. So water quality is not about only oil and gas and forestry. Now, people are concerned about biodiversity, and I think Vic showed some of the endangered species. If you look at them in detail, you realize that most of them are actually found in the white area. And so if we're looking at changes in composition and edge metrics, water quality as it's affecting birds, but if you look at mammals and fish, this is just one generalized simulation using some ABMI data sets, is you're reminded of how important the white area is. So how does agriculture fit in with that? So we go back to this need by society, if we're going to maintain public license to operate, of the triple bottom line. And we're doing quite well in some respects, but we're seeing a net degradation in much of the natural capital of the overall system. And part of it is because we tend to deal with land uses as silos and not as the system. Land use framework is intended to help integrate those to a better degree. I really wonder, as people begin to better understand both the benefits and liabilities of land use, how well agriculture will perform. I've argued before that forestry is a land use, and so is energy and transportation residential. And much of Alberta agriculture is not a land use, it's a religion. And it's often treated as such. Seemingly, it's okay to discuss it outside of land use. But for so many metrics, and I'm just going to use ecological footprint, and the amount of land required to produce a unit, hectares per cattle or hectares per cubic meter, all of these are cubic meters basically. You stuff a cow into a cubic meter, give or take, and the same crops. So there are big differences in the amount of land required to produce, quote, these commodities. So in a world where land is finite and risk capital comes in, how well will agriculture fit? And the extent to which we can help remind people that we're feeding people and we're maintaining natural capital, if we were, I think agriculture stands a much stronger chance to survive, benefit, thrive as the land use it should be. So how do we translate proper landscape management into a market opportunity for agri-food production? I continue, and I've been here before and talked to some of you folks about this, is this whole concept of priority land use. And it goes right back to soils. I mean, if you lose your soils, you lose lots. And if we're going to have agriculture in the province of Alberta for multiple generations, and not all of our soils are equally good, what policies do we have right now that maintain those soils? Because without those, we're going to see some very fast changes in the nature of our agricultural production systems. License to operate. Primarily, again, through water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, and carbon. If we can't demonstrate that agriculture is contributing towards mitigating risks in those and maintaining benefits to society, we very well might lose license to operate. Doing that requires us to adopt best management practices, and this is just 3 here, but there are so many things that agriculture can do better. Having said that, the way we conduct agriculture today isn't the way we did it 40 or 50 years ago. Lots of best management practices have been adopted. But for the most part, what we've seen is this directional shift from extensive to intensive. That is an empirical fact. How does one go from extensive to intensive and do at the same time a really good job of maintaining water quality and water quantity? Tremendous challenges in that arena. So maybe I'll conclude by suggesting that we need to continue to move from this concept of silos. And I look into this room, and most people here are interested in agriculture, and that's really important that we get together and discuss this every year. But this conversation needs to happen intersectorally too, right? There's only one system there, and you can decompartmentalize it into many others, but they're systems at the end of the day, and we have to move away from these silos thinking as we deal with water availability and quality, or carbon, biodiversity, loss of high-quality soils, and we're essentially losing our land base for crops, at least the better part of the land base. So how do you get there? Clearly, I would argue the status quo isn't acceptable. It never has been. We'll always seek better, and we've done some really good things. I guess the question I would wonder is, does the current policy that we have in the province of Alberta allow that to happen through incremental change? And if so, do we get to where we want to go, or are we looking for something that's a little bit more transformative? So anyway, just a few thoughts to leave you with and wonder, could we be talking about 15 years about being a net importer to Alberta? Thanks for the time.